Hey everybody, hope you're doing well. Welcome to another edition of the Pigpen Corner. I, of course, am Piglet, and I'm going to walk you through my process for the Moblin portrait that I posted up the other day. This is the portrait series thing I kind of was figuring I might do, like a Dark Souls-y Zelda take on the original NES stuff. I might not do more, but I'm more or less using it as a way to explore this more painterly style and have a subject matter to kind of base my exploration off of. This technique I'm going to be using is one that I am adapting from what I'm kind of perceiving to be another artist's approach, who is, I'm going to butcher your name, Piotr Jablonski, I want to say is the name. I think the Twitter handle is Nikon Pinsky, something like that. But the new art that he did for the Necromancer for Diablo 4, if you've seen that promotional work, it's really great. And I reached out to him and I asked him a couple questions about his process, and he, I had seen that he used Krita, and I initially was like, oh, I've never used Krita before. I saw that he used it. I saw Craig Mullen's post about it. I thought I'd give it a shot. And I reached out to him and I said, "Oh, I love it," because I did a cover for Venom in that program just recently, which I'll share soon. But I had worked in it and I thought it was really great, and I knew that he worked in it, so I just kind of reached out, said, I started using it because of you, so I appreciate you posting about it, because it's a really great resource. It's a free tool, by the way, so if you want to download this program, you can for free. And he mentioned that he used this one brush in there that I have since started using, and I really like it. It's called the Sketch 2 Chrome Large or something like that. It's pretty clear if you go into the program and you look at underneath the brushes tab. There's like a drop down thing. You can search sketching tools or sketching brushes, and it's the one that says Chrome in it, basically. So it's this weird kind of fill in spot blacks kind of inking brush. It's hard to describe. Like it's not organic in the way that you would use a pencil or something. It's its very own specific digital touch, which I've found oddly intuitive for what I'm doing. So I wanted to show that, and then kind of how I use it in this process, which is the starting phase. So what you're going to see is me starting to do inks using that brush in Krita. I do another pass on the inks on top of that kind of ink sketch that I start with, and then I refine it. And once I feel pretty good about that, I jump over into Photoshop, and then I use another brush which I found that Piotr used, and I kind of tighten up the sketch a bit, the ink sketch, whatever you want to call it, the ink drawing. I tighten it up black and white, and then I go in and I do the painting in Photoshop using that same brush, which I will, share on this. So anyway, I just wanted to give you a little bit of a brief thing before this just immediately gets rolling into me inking. Okay, let's go. So I've only been using Krita for a little while now, just maybe like a week at this point, a little over a week. So I'm still new to it, still getting the handle of it. That's why I'm doing a bunch of experiments. Once I have a bit more experience using it, I think that I'll have more to say. At the moment, this inking brush, though, it is something special. Like if you watch the way that it kind of wraps forms very quickly, it's interesting. It does like this whole happy accident thing, but it also feels natural in the way that it creates these broader brush strokes where you want them to be. And you can have a light touch with that brush and get nice broad strokes, which is something that I've found very appealing about it. It's actually strange how the more pressure I put on this brush, the more that it kind of thins out and isn't as intuitive. But if you keep a light hand with it, you can get very expressive quick. So I'm mocking up this kind of sketch just to play around with this approach. This is actually the first version of this process that I really used was for this Moblin drawing. This is the first time I ever really went all the way through to a painting using this initial kind of phase, which is, if you've ever seen any of my other videos, you know that I kind of work up to heavy black in the shadows and line till much later in like a painting process. So it was very foreign to me to kind of go in with heavy ink lines. But I figure that if Piotr can get such great results using it, that I could find something similar. And sometimes you just kind of click with an approach. Like I never felt super comfortable, and you've heard me talk about this if you watched previous videos, with my approach digitally painting. Like I still feel like I'm finding it. And that might seem crazy just in terms of how many things I've done in, the however long career I've had. It's like, but I still just always felt like there was something else out there. And this is just another step towards figuring out that riddle for myself. This approach feels very painterly, very natural and quick for me. The fact that I was able to wrap this up in the 2 hours and 15 minutes it took to do, it's like, it says something about the process. And I felt very positive after I finished this one. Like, this was a nice leap forward for me. I was able to control a lot of my mid-tone values, keep everything very tame. Tame as in the brushes don't go like the brush that I'm using for the final painting in this. It doesn't go super strong when you press down. It has a natural flow to it, which responds similarly to how a real paintbrush that I would use responds. And similarly to that, this brush here that you're seeing feels a lot like the way I use inks when I'm using a brush. Very similar, which is very strange to me just because it doesn't seem like it would be that way. But as soon as I started using it, I was like, oh, this feels very familiar. Here I am. I lightened up the sketch ink on one layer. I turned the opacity on that layer down to like 10% or something. I made a new layer, and I am doing another tighter pass on the drawing. I always do multiple passes on drawings because I want to make sure that I'm getting the best results. To work it up from that sketch, I would have a bunch of flaws I'd be fixing throughout the whole process. So kind of having there be a ladder approach of sketch, tighter sketch, sometimes even tighter, that helps me kind of solve a lot of the problems early so that I'm not solving them during like the painting phase. A tight drawing is very important. This brush does another thing that's kind of nice. It doesn't feel particularly sharp, even though the inks, it seems like it's very vector looking. Vector as in, the way like vector lines are incredibly sharp lines because they're meant to be vector images that can print in solid colors so that there's like a clear separation between color and forms. It seems like it's that, but it's actually relatively soft for when I move into doing like a painting. It doesn't feel like there's a bunch of hard edges that I'm removing during the painting process. It's a common thing that I ran into when I was doing a lot of pencils and things like that, and digital pencils where it has like sharp edges. And a lot of my clip studio work where I used a lot of inking brushes to do my final lines, I always found that I spent a decent amount of time trying to smooth out those hard edges that came from those inking brushes. And for whatever reason, this one doesn't do that to me, which I found kind of surprising. But look how quick this is kind of coming together. This video sped up just a little bit. It's sped up like not 100%, but 150%. So not 200%, 150%. So it's not quite twice as fast, but even so, I think I got this whole thing done in like, I don't know, less than 20 minutes or so, just for having the whole thing be rendered up. And I know that that's partially just because I'm used to drawing a bunch. but I say in comparison to what I normally do, it took me a lot less time. Interestingly, this kind of brush has a nice effect where you think differently when working. I always thought that was an interesting experiment. I brought it up before about different colored pens and writing stories and whatnot, how there's this psychological link to color or tools that you use. And when you use those tools, you think and you interface with what you're doing differently. So if you use a pencil, you might come up with certain ideas, whereas if you use like a pen, you may find others. I always thought that was kind of interesting. And I like playing around with different approaches to sketching and seeing if I can find something like that. And I think that this brush, because of the way it has those happy accidents I was talking about, it really opens me up a bit to thinking a bit more creatively and playing with shapes more, playing with silhouette especially, and shadow. I find that it has a nice kind of a freedom to it in that way, where I don't feel like I'm having to do a ton of work to find all of those shadows and wrap around these forms. It does a decent amount of that for you. This is a brush, by the way, that comes with Krita. So if you download Krita, you'll find it. It's not something that you have to go and seek out anywhere else. It's built into the program. It actually took me a minute to find it because I think I did something strange in the beginning where I lost some of the brushes in the menus and I couldn't find out like which version of Krita had the brush, because there's multiple versions of Krita within the brush menu where you can go to like their classic brushes versus their newer sets. I think I messed it up and I looked at too many different sets and kind of turned one off in the settings or something. So it should be there when you first load it up and it won't be too hard to find. You'll have to play with it a little bit to see if you can get results like this, because it took me a while to even understand it. When Piotr told me that that's what he used, this brush, I honestly was like, really? You use that brush? Like I must have just missed it completely. And then when I went back and tried it again, I was like, oh, I see how you could use this for inking. That's great. But yeah, it comes together really quick. I'm able to work in my shadows, block everything in, kind of flesh out the face a bit. I didn't spend a ton of time on this guy because I wasn't quite sure if I was even going to finish him. I didn't know if it would come out very good. Again, this was the first time I was really using this exact approach. So I wish I had done a bit more to flesh out the chest and shoulders area so that I had more information there for when I jumped into the painting. But instead of doing that, I worked it up best I could, just sketching something there. So I had a little bit of things down there in case I did want to flesh out that area. But now that I know the process better, I would go back and do things differently. So you can see the inks are coming together. Even looking at this drawing now, I think it looks pretty good for what it is, for how fast it is. If I were to even switch to doing a purely ink style using this, the only thing I would do differently, or in addition to using this brush, is I'd probably just use another inking brush with these inks and kind of paint things in and out to get a better textural feel, because this brush does, when you zoom in on this brush, it does feel very digital. So I would use a kind of naturalistic looking inking brush and just go over this again, or add to this existing ink with that texture to make it feel a bit more normal, natural. Yeah, I followed a reference for this. It is a kind of, I want to say it's a Renaissance fair picture of this bearded or mustache dude who's just kind of posing for the camera. It had a nice angle to it, and there was a decent amount of color information and value in the face, so I felt like it was a nice one to use for an experiment. So I'm not wholly coming up with this from my mind. The pig part and all that, like, that's from me, because I am basing it off of like a Moblin, but I'm also trying to make something that looks quasi-real by referencing a piece of photography. So I will post that up on the actual Patreon post for this video, so you can go and look at that if you want to see what I was looking at for reference here, and kind of get an idea of how I use reference, because it isn't directly based on the guy. I kind of loosely use reference for lighting, and I use it for pose maybe, and then a lot of like detail things like wrinkles around the eyes and around the nose and mouth and ears, just try and like see how things are sitting on a real person there. But yeah, you can check that out. So I think I'm just about to end my steps here in Krita. I don't think I go for too much longer. And then I refined this ink drawing in Photoshop right here. So I'm using the brush I talked about. You may have this brush already if you're somebody who collects a lot of Photoshop brushes. This is just a brush that I had it. I didn't realize I had it. I didn't realize I had the brush that Piotr used. I actually went to his Gumroad and downloaded it because I was just so interested in seeing his approach. I was like, your painting style looks so organic. I just want to learn from it. And then I noticed that this brush is one that he uses quite often, and I've been looking for a painterly brush, so this one stood out to me. You'll know when this video's up whether or not that brush is like a public brush, because I will leave it attached to the post if it is a brush that Piotr didn't make but in fact found somewhere. I'll make sure that it's just up there for you all to download. But if it is his brush specifically, then I will link to his Gumroad for you to download it. I think it's like a $5 download. Yeah. So anyway, I'm using the tilde key, which is the key that looks like this. It's right next to the 1 on your keyboard. I'm using that to erase out, by the way. That's what I was going to say, is that I have this brush that I'm using at 100% black, and then I paint in some value, like, I'm rendering in value in the line, and then I will hold down that tilde key, or what I have is a shortcut to that tilde key built into my little Photoshop controller, and then I paint out areas while holding that down, because it turns it into an eraser. It turns the brush you're using into an eraser. But yeah, that's what you're seeing. So using that, I paint in and out values and work it up so that it feels a bit more like a rendered drawing rather than just purely black inks. I just wanted to get some more detail in there before I jumped into color, because this is just part. I don't know if Piotr does this exact thing or would ever go into this much detail that I'm doing. This is just me adding what I tend to do with a lot of my drawings, is I go into a lot of detail at this phase to render up the values. But what I was going to say about the tilde key was that if you're in Europe, I guess there's an issue where that key doesn't actually turn that brush into an eraser. I don't know if there's a workaround for that, or if there's something that you can do to make that brush into, or to turn your brush you're using into an eraser. Feel free to drop a comment if I've ever missed that in the past, or if somebody's looking for that information. But yeah, I'm rendering things just to get some values in place so I can flesh out where that light source is coming from, make it feel a bit more naturalistic, hopefully lose a little bit of that digital look. And yeah, it comes along pretty smoothly. The combination of those two brushes to me, and this might just be my honeymoon period with this approach, but feels very good. If I don't use this one for one and like all my stuff, like the way I'm doing in this process, I will use a version of it from now on, because it feels so strong to me, and I was able to get the results I was looking for very fast. So I probably will use some iteration of these steps going forward. If I build off them and find something else that incorporates all this, but can skew towards other styles, I'll let you know, and I'll post up videos, and I'll do everything that I'm doing now for that. So yeah, the way that I'm just building this out is similar to the way that I've done a lot of my other stuff, just using the new tools. But all in all, it's very successful for what it is and just the speed. So I'm super happy with that. I was having this kind of crisis within myself for a little while, where I was thinking like, I'm not as painterly as I once was. Like, I once was the kind of artist that could block in a bunch of shapes, render it all out, and then paint it up and just kind of fix things as I go. And I found that was so inefficient for my approach and so unreliable that as the years went on, I just became somebody who drew a lot. And I just ended up doing really tight drawings and drawings for everything. And then I would render things up from there. And I thought I kind of just lost that painterly side because it just felt like it didn't fit me anymore. And then coming back to this, it was a nice reminder of all that stuff of like, oh, right, I could still do a mix of both. I can kind of get this ink drawing thing, which isn't fully drawn. It's not a ton of detail. And then I can render things out a bit more with the brush and just kind of fill it all out. And honestly, it was nice. It was nice to kind of just scratch that itch again and get back to what I was doing once. So that made me pretty happy about the whole thing. Especially once I started to get into the color part of this image. I was like, this is like a return to form for me, for back when I used to do like Ninja Turtle things. Except even then, I was doing more of like the photoreal style, where everything was very soft and kind of leaning on just like all photographic elements and noise and just that realism that I never really wanted. Like, I never really wanted to look like that. Like, when I was younger, I would look at artists like Keikai Kataki doing Guild Wars back in the day, the original Guild Wars, and I'd look at that concept art and be like, oh, this looks so painterly and cool. I wish I did things like that. Or even like Craig Mullins, where you're just looking like, I didn't know you could do that on the computer. And clearly it's because of the skill level and things, of course, but brushes and the tools that you use play a large part. Same thing as they do on traditional media. It's like, you're not going to get painterly results with a charcoal brush. So finding the right tools was always important, and finding this was kind of that. It was a nice kind of like breathing moment for me, where I was like, oh, great. Another one of those missing links, found a little bit of it. Maybe I don't use it forever. Maybe I do. But it feels nice. But yeah. So, feeling positive. It's really great. And the speed is great, because especially doing something like the Patreon, where I want to make consistent things all the time and be able to put out a lot of content and work at the speed that I know I'm capable of in my head. But it's finding the right way to kind of harness that. You need the right kind of tools and programs and all of the things to make it as intuitive as possible. And when you find each little puzzle piece that solves that, it's very satisfying. By the way, if I suddenly cut out and my dogs make a noise or bark or something like that for a split second, it's because my wife's coming home, so don't be shocked. Yeah, I'm thinking of the light source from the reference here, which if you look at the Patreon, you'll see the reference. You can kind of get an idea of what I'm following. But I'm also implying a lot of detail that is not found in the reference. So I'm doing a lot of my own things and exaggerating shapes and forms. And, clearly this man doesn't have a giant brow that comes out like a monster, or huge tusks, or a big humongous fat lip that wraps around their face, or a big pig nose. So what I tend to do is I think of, I look at the reference, I see the forms, how they're interacting with the light, how light's bouncing from the environment or whatever else, and then I start to use my knowledge of lighting to kind of fill in the gaps for all these new elements that I've introduced. I think about how the shape is like a cylinder, how light interacts fundamentally, like how you study it. And then I try to apply that to all the new shapes and follow the lighting scheme that's in the picture so that I can best adapt everything, all the information from that image into this fantasy version of it where not everything is one-to-one. That comes from a lot of things, but that more so than anything else, it comes from studying real life, painting from life. It's a question you get all the time of like, or at least I used to get it a lot back when I was doing the more realistic stuff of like, how do you get your lighting that way? Literally doing lighting like this in real life, painting from objects in my house and setting up lights on them and painting. That's it. In different textures and metal and fruit and leathers and cloth and glass and everything else. It's like having each one of these objects interact with a light source and then just spending a decent chunk of time painting it. Like I would spend maybe 4 hours trying to do a life painting. Maybe the first time it came out really terrible, but by the time I had done 16 of them or something, I'd see a little bit of a marked increase in skill. I'd be like, oh, this is coming together a little bit better than it was the last handful of times I did it. And that's it. You just build up that muscle, build up that understanding, and then you might have something that suits you more naturally than something else. So I think lighting for me lighting and form was always something that clicked with me. I don't know why, but just inking and things and thinking in terms of hard light and whatnot, it just came more naturally to me than most other things. Like anatomy and those kind of very technical precision studies, those were a little bit more difficult for me. I think I gained a little bit of that skill by doing comics for a really long time, spending 5 years just kind of drawing. That helped me tighten up that skill a bit more, but I would say that I lean naturally towards having an understanding of lighting above other aspects of my work. That's been the one that came probably the easiest to me, but it also just was something I had to supplement a lot by doing studies, like a ton of studies. So you're never going to get away from having to put in a lot of hard work to gain that knowledge and understanding you're going to need in order to paint at the highest ability you can. That's not something you can escape. So if you see me doing this and you're thinking like, where's this coming from? It's not in the reference. I don't understand it. It's just baked in knowledge from repetition. I've done so many portraits. I've done so many life paintings and things that certain stuff is just gonna stick. So don't beat yourself up too much about those sorts of things, especially if you're beginning. You just have to work that muscle, build up those skills, do the studies, and just wait until you start seeing an increase in your skill level. You may never see it yourself, but other people will probably see it before you do. And it's just consistency. It's just doing it every day, or just as much as you possibly can, scheduling it in. If you want to become proficient, if you want to be a professional working in the industry, it's going to be a part of your life. And it's going to be the same thing as if you're, attempting to do anything else where you have to train, really. Like, you're going to have to work hard, build your skills, and refine. And eventually it becomes fun, where it's just a thing of, I enjoy putting in the work and learning new things all the time. It's just like collecting Pokemon or something. It's like each time you level up and you just feel that rush, a little bit of that euphoric feeling hits you and you're like, yes, another thing happened. I hit the next point. Those moments are my favorite. And they don't happen often. They happen if you're working really hard. For me specifically, they probably don't happen for like every, 6 months to a year. Something like that. I'll have one of those moments. a real one anyway. I love the way that this brush, like at this stage right here, I really like the way that this looks like an underpainting for a real painting. If you had taken this brush, or this colored brush, and turned it like a warm red, kind of darker yellowy red, and put it on a canvas that was all gessoed up and washed with a color, it's like I could totally see that with this brush. Like it feels so convincingly real to me. It's great. So happy that I have this now in my toolbox. I'm going to use it a lot. Yeah, the texture of it is wonderful. It has like a hard edge and a soft edge to it. Yeah, building up all those forms because of that feels much more natural, where it feels like you can go very tight with detail, but also do very soft, large brush strokes. And I'm obsessed with finding brushes that can start and finish a painting, where I don't need to switch out a million different brushes, where I can get the same way that I would with a paintbrush. I just get all the texture, all the detail, all the different material feelings that I want just from one brush. Because that's how I would do it, for the most part, that's how I would do it traditionally. I don't need all of these other brushes that come with Photoshop that imply details and things. I can just do it all with the brush. I'm also very much into the idea of things feeling traditional and real. At least in the sense where those things to me, those more traditional paintings, or even digital paintings that feel traditional, they just have a nice weight to them that I can't escape. I really enjoy it. So it's hard for me to like the overly digital feel of a lot of things. It's just the same way corny people will say vinyl records have a warmth to them. I feel that way about traditional. There's a certain warmth to it, a texture that you can't quite get digitally. And when you can get pretty close to it and get the enhanced speed of digital, it's great. So that's what this is trying to achieve. Whether or not we end up there, who knows? But yeah, happy so far. But this goes on for a little bit. I render this whole face up, and really a lot of the legwork is done here. That's most of it. I don't keep things so purely black. Like, the reason I keep all of this black right now is because I want to do that thing where I paint in value and then erase out value and then paint in value, erase out, because I'm keeping this strictly one pure black color on a layer, so I can make a clipping mask layer attached to this final ink drawing, whatever that ends up being, and I can manipulate this whole thing without having to worry about flattening out any values. And here's what I mean by that. If you were to work this up the way that it looks like it's being worked up, where there's a lot of you would imagine, maybe you wouldn't, but you might imagine that I'm using gray to paint in a lot of the values in the face. Like, that's just me selecting gray and painting that in to get those little midtones and things, to get some value range, but I'm not. It's all black. But if I had used gray and then light gray and then white, and then I went all the way to black, and then I did some in between, and I rendered and just selected around using the eyedropper, if I did try to manipulate this layer specifically and change values or colors within the inked parts, just all the values that are there, if I wanted to change them into red or something like that, I would end up, if I made a clipping mask layer to this, flattening out those values. It would just turn them all that flat color, rather than it being light gray, dark gray, black. It would all be this one flat tone, because it would just fill in where all the brush strokes were. You can get around that with color layers and whatnot, but I'm not a huge fan of that because I like to do a lot of my base colors, like filling in this character's body, their skin, all of that. I like to do that underneath this drawing. So I keep this drawing here, I'll make a layer beneath it, and then I'll do all of my fill colors, my painting, the nose and the tusks and the eyes and ears and all the different shades that are going to go in there. So to have this all be on one layer and have all the white just be areas that I erased and all the gray just be thinned out black that I erased allows me a high level of control once I get into that phase where I'm just doing little tweaks to the colors and adding things in to lighten some of the values, which you'll see that probably shortly. I can't imagine this is very far from being complete. But yeah, that's why I do that, and it's something that I enjoy controlling it that way because it gives me a lot of depth in terms of what I can do, bringing this into a place where it's going to have where it's going to have like all of my brush strokes intact, all those inked brush strokes that I have right there. It's going to keep all that information there, and all I have to do is subtly skew the color a little bit to have it blend with the painting. That way I don't have to do a bunch of extra painting on top of this to get rid of all of the black lines that I did or all the gray lines, if that makes sense. So there you go. I did a selection on the exterior of the character, just the white space around him, which selected all the white area. And then I went to select in the menu and I did inverse selection. And then I went to select, modify, contract by 2 pixels, and then select, modify, feather by 1 pixel. And then I filled it in with that gray blue tone. And then on a layer beneath that, I'm just doing a kind of canvas brushwork type thing to fill in a bunch of color information behind the character just to give them a background. And a background actually does quite a bit. If you were to plan out a background, if you weren't going to plan out a background beforehand, you can run into a few issues where you're painting in values for your character, and then when you drop a background in, like a much darker background or some mid-tone background, you can see that a lot of the values are reading very differently because you had started them all in a white background, and therefore the information just feels different because it's not interacting with that same lighting scenario. When you're working in values the way I did and then filling in colors like this, you don't really have to worry about that because you can skew it a lot and do a lot of alterations to them. But if you were to render it up completely, colors and all, then you'd have to do some editing to make it sit well with that background after the fact. It's nice to have something there just so that you know, generally speaking, what those colors are going to be and the environment that are going to affect your character. So now I locked the layer that the blue was in, that gray blue. So it's just the little checkerboard pattern. You click on the layer that you want to lock and you click that checkerboard pattern in the layers menu. And now I'm just using a textured brush to select the blue. I move the sliders over here on the right, the color sliders. Was that the HSB? I can't remember now off the top of my head. But I use that to just kind of keep my colors within a similar value range as that blue. And I'm just working in some other tones. Basically just filling out some Moblin colors. Or the Dark Souls man-pig version. Yeah, trying to keep all of the colors fairly subtle. but still trying to add in a little bit of saturated blue there, just because I don't want it to be a completely grayed out painting. And building up, I'm going to continue to build up a little bit of value within this as well. So it won't be entirely this like flat color with the blacks there. Like I'll also, beneath this inked painting, or the value painting rather, I'm going to then render in some lighting there, like you're seeing here, where I'm just dropping in some highlights on the forms, using a texture brush, creating a little bit of like a scattered, dotted look to it to make it look like light's catching on pores. Just some information below so that when I start painting on top of this, I have a decent base to go off of. Like I have most of my information there so that I can just render freely without having to make a ton of adjustments as I go to the colors and lighting. Yeah, this was a fun experiment because I felt like in a lot of my previous paintings I've been leaning heavily on high contrast, more saturated tones, and not so much texture. Or at least if I had texture, it was very similar. Maybe it was a little too uniform. And now I'm trying to keep things very subtle, work in a difficult value range where things are going to be more monotone throughout, much like my voice, and that it would hopefully be a bit of a challenge. Get out of my comfort zone a little. This is a soft light layer that is a clipping mask attached to the base layer, and I'm just brushing in some warm light into the shadows, so kind of like a mid-tone, darkish, brownish red, just because I want to add a little bit of warmth to the character, give some blood beneath the skin. Adding some green as well. Just because you want to add a couple, when you're going for something kind of realistic, I want to make sure that a lot of the color information that's sitting in the environment is also picking up on the skin and in the clothes and whatnot. So now I'm doing a selective color layer just to kind of play with the colors that I've already established. You can see how that works. Just skewing it slightly. Yeah. I'll use selective color to more or less be selective with my colors, where I'll select, cyan and then just pump up that tone because I want it to be way more vibrant. I want that vibrant blue to come through. So I'll use that to adjust it in a minuscule way so that it just pops a little bit more. And I'm doing a multiply layer here to knock in some shadows. I know that there is already shadow information here, but I want to make sure that I do a little bit more just to unify the character a bit more with the background. So usually my shadows, the color for the shadow at least, is based on the secondary light source. So you have your primary light source, like if you're looking at me right now in the corner, right? If it wasn't so dark, I would say that you're seeing light hit me here, which would be the primary. So what's coming from my computer screen, or the light right over there. And then the secondary light is the light of the room, or the sky, or a secondary light like a rim light or something like that. So that colored light, whatever it is, if you have the sun, just to keep it simple, you have the sun in the sky, that's your primary. Let's say this is the sun hitting me. Everything in the shadow, it might lean a little bit blue if it's a sunny day with no clouds, or depending on what the character's near or what you're near, that light will hit that shadow side. So when I do something like this, I feel that the background lighting of this character leans mostly towards a greenish gray tone. So the multiply layer is all that. It's just a greenish gray. Oh, and what I just did, what you're watching right now, I made a clipping mask layer on top of my render layer that was just that black ink, and now I am using a textured brush to select around the canvas for different tones in the face, and I'm lightly brushing out some of that value on top. So all of the rendering is still there. All of the brushwork that I did, painting in those gray tones and things, just using black, just very lightly painting every little bit of value. So you can see me turn it on and off. I'm working some of that out so that it doesn't feel like everything on top of these colors is just variation of black. I want to make it feel like that's real brushwork, so that I had, I did some red strokes with the brush around the nose, and I did some blue around parts of the skin, just to blend those brush strokes a bit more seamlessly. And it also makes it look like I had painted all of this together, on top of a sketch or something, and that those final brush strokes are there just reading as a render in color rather than a grayscale thing that I'm trying to make color. If that makes sense. I hope it does. I know sometimes these things can sound a bit floaty when you're trying to explain all these different processes at the same time. So now I'm doing another selective color. This time I pressed Command, or I believe you would press Control on a Windows computer, and I selected the base fill color for this character to create a selection, and then on top of all of the layers using that selection, I created another selective color adjustment. This time I'm adjusting the colors that were beneath the render that I had done and the black render itself. So you can see how the colors are skewed a bit more using that information with the information below it and the colors. And I'm able to further distance myself from just a black inked drawing. All right, now I'm going to select that painterly brush, and for the rest of this I will be using the information I've established here and finishing up this painting so that it feels like I, have some hopeful, traditional looking portrait completed. That was the goal, is that I would get to some end where this looked good. And already I can tell that I'm going to love it because I just begin blending and painting. And when a brush reacts the way that this one does, where it feels like the pressure that you're giving it is being reflected in the brush stroke, as opposed to something that doesn't quite hit the nail on the head, it's very satisfying, and this is one of those brushes. So I know there's that meme of the brush doesn't matter, it's all about the skill, whatever. Yes, that is true. You're not going to find a secret pen that makes you incredible at drawing or something. But you will find things that feel better, that feel more natural, that fit who you are and how you like to do things and how your mind works. And this, for me, was one of those. And I always feel like maybe I'm just like a recluse where I don't talk to enough artists. And I know this isn't necessarily true because I'm always digging for things, but I always think in my mind, like, God, does everybody know about this? Does everybody know about the way certain brushes like this feel? And I'm the only one who doesn't. It's nice to have the Patreon because I have other people like you who can respond and be like, yeah, I didn't use this brush for that. This is cool. Or like, yes, that does feel good. This is great. And I'm like, oh, okay, cool. Makes me feel a little bit less crazy. And there's another funny thing that I heard where I saw a comment in regards to this video coming out talking about how does one artist learn from another artist that's also like pro. And I know this isn't the takeaway from that comment necessarily, but it made me think of how there's this idea that like you're going to get to a certain level and you're going to kind of stop trying new things or stop learning or something. But I don't have any kind of ego about that sort of thing. I just try to get better, and if I see somebody doing something great and it feels in line with something I've always wanted to be able to do, or it's getting close to a style that's something I kind of always saw myself wanting to do, then I'll reach out to them and just ask questions. Thankfully, within this industry, I have a name enough where when I do reach out, I usually get a response. That won't always be the case for everybody. That didn't happen to me early on. This is a habit I got into when I was young. When I was 19, I used to reach out to professional artists and I would just ask them questions, and almost all the time I didn't get a response. It's not a bad thing, but it was few and far between. Certain people did reply. I got responses from Justin Sweet, Marco Durdjevic. I got a response from Todd Lockwood, and a few others, and they were very helpful. So you take a bunch of shots, you try, and you might get something back. But I still do that. So I reach out to artists who I think are doing really cool things, and if they want to talk about their work or offer up any sort of help or questions I'm having, then that's great. And if they don't, then it's fine. It's no problem at all. I wasn't expecting anything, and I'm just kind of hoping, and then if it works out, it works out. And this was one of those times where it worked out. So yeah, I think that you shouldn't be shy about those things, and you shouldn't have too much pride to see somebody else doing something and think that they do a thing more efficiently than you, or just they have a proclivity to do towards something that's out of the league of what you're currently doing. It's like maybe that can be the thing that helps you and grows you, but you're never going to find it unless you just ask. And I honestly find that being in a space where, like I've been working on, like I mentioned in previous videos, this video game for a little over a year now as a concept artist. And just in the space of that year, because I'm around a lot of other artists and talking, or at least just other people within the team, I'm able to pick up on little tidbits information that speed me up, because I'll share my screen, show how I do things, and then somebody will be like, how come you don't do this? And I'll be like, oh, never even thought about that. And then I'll bring that into my style. And that'll be something that helps me. And I grow just a little bit more, or I get a little bit faster, or just a little bit more efficient. All of those things, all those small things add up into mountains over time. So make sure that you ask a lot of questions. And especially in this kind of patron Q&A thing we got going on, you can always ask me those sorts of things. If you have specific tool questions or anything really just nitty gritty things, feel free to ask that. Or if you catch me on a stream working on like a contest entry type deal, feel free to jump on and ask, and I'll hit on that. But yeah, it's never bad to really try and reach out and ask for some help. So there's two versions of this brush. One of them I found was very nice for detail, and the other one you can also use for detail, but it has a really nice broad stroke to it where I can blend the painting quickly without going into these little sharp brush strokes. So that's kind of what I'm doing here on the tusk right now, blending that out. So you can see kind of how that brings it together a little bit more. The way that this blends color, this brush, is what's drawn me to it the most. Like I love the feel of it, but the way that it looks when it blends those colors together is something else. Even watching this now, it makes me excited to do some more paintings. It's like, God, I want to try some more paintings. Yeah, and then I'm working in the shadow there, trying to make it a bit more subtle. That cast shadow. I tried to do something a bit more uncomfortable in this style, and that's when I did the guts painting that you probably saw on the Patreon. That guts painting was way outside of my comfort zone for what I wanted to do, because I wasn't like, I hadn't really nailed this style down yet, and I still haven't. So I was just thinking, what's the more intimidating thing? Trying to paint some beloved character realistically, because people hate that, especially when it's from manga or like an anime or something. And I used a reference, kind of like how I did here, just so that I had something to go off of. And it was like an older guy. And I probably fumbled that one a bit too much. But, I mean, it wasn't like this. Like, it's so much easier to paint monsters and things. And it's not too hard to paint human, like, realistic characters if I'm doing, like, a cover where there's more than one thing going on. But when you're doing a portrait and you got to get all the subtleties right, and the whole draw of it is just the face, you open yourself up to so many criticisms. So I just figured might as well jump in and see if I can do that without fucking it up too much. I don't think I succeeded, but it was a nice exercise. But even in that very intimidating space, I found that the brushes were very effective. So it was a nice exercise, and I learned a lot from it. And I'm excited to continue building this out. I mean, honestly, this makes me want to do all sorts of wild, like, fantasy paintings, going old school, doing some of the things I used to do for, like, my old Black Witch project. Like, specifically, that would be a great place for this style. Maybe I'll end up doing something with that. But yeah, very happy with it. I used this brush a bit on the challenge entry as well. So if you saw my skeleton dude that was all blown up and muscled out, huge, like that was using this brush for a decent amount of it anyway. But yeah, going in, doing those little fiddly details. Like, it reminds me of a lot of the way, we just talked about him, the way Justin Sweet paints and Vance Kovacs. If you look at their work, not that they use anything similar to what I'm doing, but that feeling of that traditional digital feel, I kind of started to tap into that a little bit, which was nice. I was like, oh, cool. I can almost taste how they do that. And I'm a big fan of their work, Justin Sweet and Vance Kovacs. I say their work because I feel like they're so in league with one another when it comes to their style, that they have a very similar feel. And their concept art is just amazing. So if I can tap into that, that'd be wonderful, because I love that kind of thing. I've always had that sweet spot, you know what I'm saying, for that type of work, because I find that it's got that nice tooth to it that I'm talking about, but it still has the speed of digital, and they're able to create like movie concepts that look traditional. I feel that way with Ian McKeag as well. Ian McKeag has a lot of great work that feels like that nice happy medium, but I think he uses a bit more kind of normal Photoshop brushes from what I've seen, almost like chalk brushes and, you know, the stuff that's kind of typical. And he's the case where like skill is everything, I feel, where his structure and his drawings are so sound that it almost doesn't matter how he renders them out. It's going to come out cool. So if you see the secondary light I was talking about before, it's starting to come through in the shadow, well, the cast shadow from that tusk. Cast shadow's great because it helps define out the form a bit more, so you can pop objects off one another and create a nice three-dimensional space. So if you ever have the opportunity to do that sort of thing, it's great. I found that it always makes things feel 3D and more realistic. It's just a little cheap trick in a lot of ways. But anyway, I mean, it's also in how you purposefully set up your lighting so that you can be advantageous with those sorts of cells on the forms. But what I was going to say was that secondary light being that warm kind of green, gray, red look, I put that into the shadow of the tusk so you can see how that's reading there, where it feels like a natural shadow that's bouncing light from the environment. Those are the things you have to keep in mind when you want to make something sit in a space naturally. It's kind of subtle, but not. And it's that little extra push that makes something feel real-ish, or the illusion of reality. Yeah, lots of just rendering things out now. Because my base render in the drawing and inked painting type thing, because that whole underpainting was so tight, I was able to work this up to a pretty quick finish. So it's nice. It always pays off to spend your time in the drawing phase. I've mentioned this online, and I've talked about how important drawings are in the past, but I swear, more so than anything else, the root of most of my problems when it comes to work that I'm doing, when I am hours into a painting and I realize something's starting to kind of, just look ugly, just look bad, something's off, 99% of the time it's because of a bad drawing. I just didn't put in enough effort in solving the problems in the drawing. And because of that, things just aren't going to work in the painting, because the more real it looks, the less good all of those little mistakes that you might have gotten away with like a sketch, they just start looking like sore thumbs. You're just like, oh my God. And then you have to figure it out in the painting, and that's rough. But if you can solve it in the drawing, it's much better. It's much cleaner. So I would say that's why I like this one. I feel like I solved enough of the problems while I was working it out in the beginning. Yeah, working out that bounce light there, that side lighting. That's another cheap trick. I tried not to do it too much on this one. I didn't want it to be blown out like the old turtle portraits that I did, TMNT things I did a long time ago. Like, there's this whole thing where you're just kind of making fun of all of the times you just use rim lighting to solve all your problems. But I do want to make the character pop off the background. That's truly the only purpose for it in a lot of cases for me. It's like I just use it as a way to make sure that the head's popping off the background. But it is something regrettable sometimes. I'm like, you don't want to make everything you do look the same. Oh man, how quickly those colors blend with this brush is just, God, it's delicious. I could eat it. Those thick, juicy brush strokes. Wonderful. It's making me happy just looking at it. Yeah. Oh man. I'm just in my mind thinking of the thing we talked about in one of the portfolio reviews. We were talking about how cool it would be to do a challenge where we do the Dark Souls Pokemon thing, where you take the Pokemon and then you bring them into a Dark Souls look and see how you would paint them realistically like this in a setting like that. And I was just thinking, this is the perfect style for, maybe not that specifically, but this same idea of rendering up these kind of Dark Souls looking tones and color schemes, and the brushwork feeling like traditional fantasy stuff. I could see that being a lot of fun. I mean, most of the time I do those sorts of things because it's just the easy thing for people to share online. And it's nice to put in your, portfolio for people who are just looking for stuff to check out. People love sharing things that they know, And you don't have to do that. A lot of people don't want to do the whole painting things like cynically for marketing purposes. I just genuinely like doing that sort of thing. So I'm not always doing it to be cynical. Sometimes I used to force it just because it was like habit to do. But most of the time it comes along naturally. I more or less have a slight tinge of regret because I always think I could be doing something else that's more productive. But then I can't get away from the fact that it's nice to just have a thing that you can paint that already has a design and already has all these things, so that the only thing you have to worry about is the technique you use. Because so much of what I do is just exploring style and exploring how to use different brushes in different ways to render things up. So to have a kind of stock character in mind, so you're not thinking about all the extra things you think about when you design things from scratch. It's just nice. Rendering a pig nose. Doesn't get better than that. That's why it's so much fun to paint monsters. You can do all these protruding forms, and you can make as many shapes as you want, get as wrinkly as you want, make things grotesque and detailed. And you got to be way more subtle in human faces because we're just so used to looking at people that any wrong thing sticks out. You know what it is when you see it. Specifically about that guts that I did. What I realized after the fact, I saw it in a comment. Somebody was talking about the lips, feeling like he's too old. Like, what's he doing with these thin lips? It just made me laugh because I was just in the mindset of like, I'll just knock stuff out and post it. If I just waited a day, just one day, and I looked at it again, I would have caught those things, and it wouldn't just be out in the world now. Oh well. It was always meant to be an experiment, so it's fine. If it wasn't, I would have planned a cooler composition or just something, crazier than that. But for a quick 2-3 hour thing, not too bad. But man, those old lady lips that he's got, those are rough. I was like, oh no. He looks like my friend's mom. No. Yeah, this is very close to being done. Rendering out just a little bit of detail beneath the skin there. Just some bony kind of skull shape there. So for the rest of this, I'm just going to kind of talk about my goals going forward with this all in the Patreon. The whole idea being that I want to get to a place where I can paint that realistic looking painting style of like a Andrew Whalen or something like that. I want to get that kind of I want to get the nowness of where people are at digitally, like painting, like the kind of things I've been doing, modern whatever technique and things. But I also want to go back to that traditional stuff. I want to paint cat people with laser guns and things like that, just because it's so dumb. I want to go back in time. I want to bring all those ideas back and do them very earnestly, and just hopefully be able to elevate all of that by growing my skill, and then have there be a whole bunch of really dumb fantasy paintings that exist, like dinosaurs in a Cadillac with somebody who traveled back in time from the future, gave them all laser guns and stuff and swords and all that. I want to do those classic kind of pulp covers that I had when I was a kid. If I could get back to that, that would be ideal. If I could paint like this, subject matter, just connect them together, then I would be very happy. What are the chances of that happening? Who knows? But I'm going to shoot for it because it's worth doing, and it would make me happy. Like, I don't want to just be like another art person working like this who's just doing normal stuff. I feel like that would be a waste of effort. I want to get back to doing sillier things. I feel like this is the first time I've hit it. I've hit it a little bit. Where if it were painted like this, then it would feel very earnest. And I'm not trying to make anything cynical. I ain't for that. I'm gonna pause this real quick. I'll be right back. Hey, we're back. So, yeah, that's my goal. If I can do that, I'll be happy. This is honestly how I wish I had painted my Castlevania paintings. Like if you saw my big one, like the original NES Castlevania with Simon Belmont and all that. This is how I saw it in my head. But God, it doesn't look like this. This is also how I saw the Metal Gear Solid painting going down. And it definitely didn't look like this. But live and learn, you know? And I know things are going well so far with this because my wife, well, Kim, she came in here and was looking at me painting and she was like, oh, this feels like what you've been trying to do for a long time. And I'm like, I'm so glad I didn't even have to say that you just figured it out. And then to read some of your nice comments about how this stuff has come along. It feels gratifying. I'm like, yes, I think it's on the right path now. I'm trying to avoid doing the meme of the Patreon saying that I figured it out, because I haven't yet. I'm figuring it out. How about that? Almost there. So yeah, I'm gonna let the rest of this play out for a little bit. I might do like a little sped up thing here just because a lot of this is just kind of rendering, and then I'll hop back in just so I'm not rambling and rambling in your ear. Yeah, I'll be back in a second. So I'll hop in here because this is kind of an interesting part. The problem I had because I didn't actually render out the body is that so much of that information just isn't there, so I had to come up with a lot of it. Makes it look a little funny because, it just wasn't planned. So I was just using the brush to kind of paint in and render a little bit of the forms. But yeah, it just doesn't really read right. Looks strange. So you always want to make sure, again, the drawing thing, make sure everything's there in the drawing so that you're not having to do stuff like this later on and try and make it work. Because you can make it work. It's just going to take some effort. And you're going to need to kind of come back from that brink. So I always think that that's like the hardest part about the way I used to paint was that I'd block in all of these forms and then 15 hours later I would still be there trying to finish up all this stuff because I'd have to figure it all out. I'd have to draw while painting at the same time. And you just think differently. At least I do. Where I don't think in the same sense. I don't have the same kind of I guess relation to the initial drawing where I'm understanding like how everything kind of goes together. I get lost in forms. I get lost in kind of how everything's sitting on the character. And because I can get a lot of tighter detail in that base drawing, and I'm working it out without having to also grapple with, are the values correct? Is the rendering consistent? How are the colors? It's like all of those things also need to be addressed throughout the whole process. So it's like you're adapting and changing, but you're juggling drawing, painting, and all the information that comes with both of those while solving that issue. And it's just so cumbersome, and I never like doing it. So when I see that, when I see myself trying to figure out the chest and like block that in, I'm like, God, that doesn't look good, does it? So I wish I hadn't done that. I wish I'd actually painted up all that stuff in the bottom. The last thing I usually do on these paintings is things like this, like roughing in some scars and whatnot. Just topical things, hairs, small, sharp, kind of tight specular detail. Those sorts of things are kind of the last bits you do in a painting. You want to work large to small, so working up all the values, building up to, little tighter and tighter details. All of those things are important because you don't want to lose your image by focusing too much on little tiny things early on. Because if the broader image isn't working, then all of those little details are kind of just, basically polishing a turd, is what everybody says. And it's correct. It's not there to do that yet. It's like you're trying to do the little victory lap on the final pass of the painting early on when you didn't have it all sorted out in the beginning. You skip ahead just a little bit. So I wanted to show you this. This is another example of the, not doing enough kind of work to plan out the image ahead of time. Because this was just an experiment. Again, I wasn't planning on having this be a full illustration. But because I liked the brush and because I thought it was fun to draw with, I was like, why not give a shot at doing some trees in the background? I actually found that you could probably imply a lot of detail with trees and all that with this brush pretty easily. So it's not out of the question that you could paint in a lot of natural elements using this. But I still wish compositionally that I had factored that in when I did my initial drawing. So I don't end up doing too much of this because it would just take a lot longer than I was planning on really spending on this image. And that tree had to go right away because there's a tangent there of it touching on the edge of that tusk there, which, that was never going to fly. It's not good. I think by the end of this, I actually, if you look there, I paint all of it out. And then I dropped it back in for the final post. So I want to show you this part here. On top of everything, I just kind of thought, why not use the Gregor Rutkowski texture over top. He has like that canvas brush texture. I think it's a part of the free oil brush pack that he has on his Gumroad, if you don't already have it. And you can just kind of lightly brush over top your whole thing, and it makes it feel like some of the base canvas is kind of peeking through, like it's an old scratchy painting, which is a nice effect if you're doing these kind of old school looking traditional portraits. But I don't do it too much on this one because I felt like it was a little strange. So yeah, that was the drawing and painting process for this Moblin. I hope that it was helpful. If you have any questions or comments or follow-ups to this, please feel free to let me know below in the Patreon post, and I will address them as they come in. And yeah, I hope you have fun playing with this technique, with the brush, with Krita, and I will talk to you more. I'll have a lot more to say about Krita and everything else as well. So yeah, see ya.